Well, in 1931, Phil Strong's novel of State Fair was published and was a terrific success. And 20th Century Fox snapped up the rights, and a year later in 1933 came out with a non-musical movie, essentially as a vehicle for Janet Gaynor, who was an ingenue they had under contract at the time.
Philip Strong, the author of the original novel State Fair, specialized in talking about the loves and passions of farm people who we think of as having very bland lives.
I wish you loved me and Wayne the way you do Blue Boy.
Well, I'm not trying to get you two kids ready to try to win a prize at the big state fair, am I?
And the state fair was excitement for that family. They were coming to town, and they were showing off something they had really worked the whole year to make happen. It's not just a family going in to have a good time, but Mother has worked on these preserves. The father is taking Blue Boy. It's a big deal for this family.
The film was shot in the fall of 1932 and released early in January 1933. State Fair idealized and romanticized American rural life and made no reference at all to the Depression.
Up here it doesn't seem like the same world.
It isn't. We're going around in circles, just as they are on Earth. Only. They think they're getting somewhere. We know we're not.
It became sort of exemplar to the world of what American rural life was like. This, to foreign audiences, was what rural America was. The sort of rosy, idealized picture, but with real people, people who could laugh and cry and be disappointed in love.
I do love you, Wayne. But I wouldn't marry you for anything in the world.
It was a terrific success for Fox. It was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Picture and for Best Adapted Screenplay.
Musical film came in, obviously, at the beginning of the sound era. In fact, it was the first and only kind of film that had not been possible during the silent era. And I think audiences at that time really kind of got in touch with why they loved musicals. And a lot of it just has to do with the simple fact that musicals have this unique propensity for making fantasies real. We all, at one time or another, I think, wouldn't mind getting up and just bursting into song.
Maybe it's more than the moon. Maybe it's more than the bird.
It's a very special kind of escapism. And it continued that way from the early 1930s through the end of the 1960s. And, of course, State Fair, in its original 1945 version, came at the sort of heyday of the musical film when musical film was a normal, weekly, regular part of an audience's diet.
Well, the team of Rodgers and Hammerstein hadn't really been established as a team when Oklahoma opened. Clearly, the world accepted it, and it was a major, major hit on Broadway. And so I have a feeling that just before Rodgers and Hammerstein could decide to write another show, along came 20th Century Fox.
About taking the 33 movie of State Fair and turning it into a musical. Fox screened it for them here in New York City at their studios on 56th Street, and that Rodgers and Hammerstein immediately responded to it and thought it was a terrific movie and would make a good musical.
It was attractive to be asked to do something like this, and because State Fair was similar in style and place and locale somewhat to Oklahoma, it seemed sort of logical.
However, both Rodgers and Hammerstein individually had worked in Hollywood before, and neither of them really much cared for it. So they told Darryl Zanuck, who was the head of the studio at the time, that they'd be happy to write the songs for a musical of State Fair if they could stay in the East to do it and not go to California. And the studio agreed.
The first musical version of State Fair was directed by Walter Lang. He had started in silent films, and by the late 1930s, he was at Fox and starting to direct some of Shirley Temple's movies. And State Fair was certainly a big feather in his cap over the succeeding years and directed some big Fox musicals like There's No Business Like Show Business, which was a very expensive Fox musical. And then probably his best film was the film version of The King and I, for which he got his only Oscar nomination. Jean Crane was sort of the hot newcomer. She had been first noticed at the RKO commissary when she was there on a school trip by none other than Orson Welles, who had her read for the ingenue role in The Magnificent Ambersons. And she was too young. She was about 16 at the time. Her first film role was in the Fox movie The Gang's All Here in 1943. Then Zanuck cast her in a horse race movie in 1944 called Home in Indiana. He immediately saw her as the logical successor to, who else? Janet Gaynor, the Fox star of the early 1930s.
Now, Jean Crane didn't sing, so they brought in a woman by the name of Luann Hogan to sing for Jean Crane in the movie. Well, strangely enough, it was such a hit, and Jean Crane was so popular after State Fair that she sort of got typecast as a singing actress, even though she didn't sing. So Fox essentially put Luann Hogan under contract to do nothing but sing for Jean Crane. So she went on to have kind of this musical career that was sort of by accident. That never would have happened if she hadn't done State Fair.
It was during the war, at the time that State Fair was being put together, and several of the other Fox leading men, like Tyrone Power, were fighting. So people like Dick Haymes sort of had more of an opportunity than maybe they would have in a more competitive atmosphere.
He was a big singer with the Tommy Dorsey Band and the Harry James Band and Benny Goodman. He had a recording contract at Decca. He had his own radio show. He's a big recording artist, so everybody knew who Dick Haymes was.
And Fox had signed him, and he was, I guess, considered probably the most viable choice for Wayne.
There's a nice string of pearls. I think I'll have a go at them. Oh, I know they're fakes, but...
Wayne, what are you doing?
Dick Haymes pretty much played Dick Haymes, so he didn't really go very farm boy to play Wayne Frake. He looks in the movie pretty much like Dick Haymes, he dresses pretty much like Dick Haymes, and maintains that smooth crooner image that Dick Haymes always had.
The character of Wayne from 1933 to 1945 doesn't really change that much. He has this sort of single-minded obsession about going back and defeating the Carney Barker with the ring toss, and you see that in both versions.
I'm going to put up 3 nice, new, crisp $1 bills. Is that real money?
I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to put down 3 nice, new, crisp $1 bills.
You might have wished for a little more of an appealing farm boy quality. And that really came, I think, more in 1962. I think the casting of Pat Boone is one of that film's more successful elements.
And a dream in my heart that's for you.
Well, Dana Andrews was already a star by that point. What nobody knew is that Dana Andrews had come out to California to be an opera singer. Well, when State Fair came along and they cast him, they didn't know he could sing, so they hired some guy to dub the songs for Dana Andrews.
It's a grand night for singing.
Andrews always maintained that he never told him he could sing because he figured the guy they hired to dub for him needed the work. Pat in the novel is very open emotionally. He comes right out and tells Margie, I love you. I want to marry you.
If you married me, you'll tie yourself to one place and one woman all your life. You'd have to. I wouldn't stand for other women.
And Margie has to sort of be the voice of reason who says, look, this would never work. In the other version, starting in 45, Pat is sort of a ladies' man, sort of a no-good-nick.
Anyway, it's pretty hard for me to picture myself, what do they call it, popping the question? Can you imagine me suddenly turning to some girl and blurting out, will you marry me?
He's got an edge, which is what attracts Margie to him. There's a danger in Pat that fascinates her. She's never met a boy back in Brunswick, Iowa, who's like Pat Gilbert is. And he remains that way through the succeeding film.
Come on, baby. Remember those IBM machines. Let's get at it before people go out of style.
I know Zanuck originally intended the role of Emily to go to Alice Faye, who was the premier singer at the studio at the time. She was winding down her career, so she ended up not being Emily. And She had to wait for another 16 years or so to be in the 1962 State Fair, this time, of course, playing the mother.
I'm not going to load my mincemeat with brandy.
Vivian Blaine was under contract to 20th Century Fox, and she had done several films there. She had started out like Dick Haymes as a band singer.
That's for me.
And I believe she was considered sort of a second-string Alice Faye type. She had that sort of lush, contralto-ish voice and kind of a knowing urban manner, even though she was still in her early 20s. In 1950, she created the role of Miss Adelaide in the original production of Guys and Dolls. And you see State Fair now, and you can see little pre-echo of Miss Adelaide sometimes when she does things with her voice. With Ma and Pa Frake, you get a certain sense of consistency from the first State Fair to the second State Fair. Will Rogers was the top-billed star in 1933.
Bring you here to the fair. What do people think of you anyhow?
His character sort of dominates the film in a way that it doesn't really in the two musical versions. But that had to do with the fact that people loved Will Rogers.
Hampshire boy, blue boy.
Well, Charles Winninger, who played the father, Abel Frake, in the 45 movie, Hammerstein had worked with years before he created the role of Captain Andy in the original 1927 production of Showboat.
You better take me to the Midway tonight for a little fun.
Faye Bainter was certainly a well-known actress by the time she did State Fair. Actually, who was middle-aged by the time she got into movies. She didn't really have a career as a young woman, and she was the first actress to be nominated for 2 Academy Awards in the same year. And she actually won the Academy Award in 1938 as supporting actress for Jezebel, and lost the Best Actress Oscar to her Jezebel co-star, Bette Davis.
Maybe I'm not a girl to have and to hold.
In order for any musical to work, you have to set a vocabulary right at the beginning, because we don't go around singing to each other. It's a false sense of artistic license.
In our air-conditioned patent leather farmhouse.
Plastic.
Therefore, the art of a musical is to figure out how you create characters and create stories and situations when words with the meter to them can seem to come out of character without it being obvious or awkward or peculiar. So right away, all of the Rodgers and Hammerstein musicals have to set that up right at the beginning, somehow at the beginning. I mean, overtures are usually a good way to start. And if you look at the first songs in their shows, it's absolutely fascinating.
Our state fair is a great state fair. Don't miss it, don't even delay. It's dollars to donuts that our state fair is the best state fair in our state.
Our State Fair is, in a way, an American folk song. It's a march, it's rousing, it tells you the fair is coming to town.
Our state fair is a great state fair. Don't miss it, don't even be late.
One of the real genius that Rodgers and Hammerstein had is they were capable of writing songs that when you heard them, you thought that song was always written.
It's really not so much a song as a ditty. It's only 16 measures long. It's just got 4 short little phrases. And I think Hammerstein's intent and Rodgers' intent with that song was to write a song that sounded like a little pop song of the time that would be the State Fair motto song.
It's just the sort of assimilation of a sense of where you needed to be, and Rodgers was brilliant at morphing it through his own particular voice to put you where you needed to be, and Hammerstein was equally good. It's just a little harder to tell that in words than it is in music.
Richard Rodgers described his role beautifully once when he said, every time I sit down to write a song, I am standing in front of the orchestra and I am looking up at a stage and I see a boy and a girl and they're in a particular setting and in a particular situation and they're talking to each other in a particular way and the lights seem to be a certain way and the mood starts to come out of what they're saying to each other and the music begins.
My time was morning and morning was noon. Now that you've touched me. There's no time.
But for Rogers, it went further, and it went in a direction that somehow out came a melody.
Willing and eager as you are for me.
And that melody was usually so good at expressing what those characters were thinking and feeling that even today it's hard to not hear one of the great songs that Rodgers and Hammerstein wrote and not feel a character. In Hammerstein's copy of Phil Strong's book, he has earmarked places this could be a song, and you see that in all of his sources. Early on, they had ideas, and they would talk about it. They would say, this feels like a musical moment.
One of the interesting sort of classic examples of a song that needs to be there, but it has a big problem, is It Might As Well Be Spring, because when Rodgers and Hammerstein were writing the musical version of it, they felt that the character of Margie has spring fever.
Be glad to get to the fair. Hear something different. See something different for a change.
So I started to write a poem about a girl having spring fever. And then with a terrible shock, I realized that no state fairs are held except in the autumn. And ready to abandon an idea regretfully, I then thought, no, maybe she just feels this way, although it's fall, and that gave me even a better theme. It might as well be spring.
Richard Rodgers often cited It Might As Well Be Spring as a perfect match of melody and lyric to the lyric, I'm as jumpy as a puppet on a string.
All right, now, what do you do with a puppet on a string?
Dangle it, move it up and down.
To jump.
I'm as jumpy as a puppet on a string.
However, at the Library of Congress, in his collection of his manuscripts, there's another alternate melody to that song. We don't really know, but it looks like he wrote something first, and the jumpy as a puppet on a string didn't occur to him right away. It was when he had a rethink about it that he went back and thought, oh, wait a minute, this is the way it works. And again, as I said before, he was very proud of that specific thing, and he used it as an example often of how music and lyrics have to match each other in tone and spirit.
See, it's the hop. This is the interpretation of the words. You couldn't do this without the words. But one must interpret the other.
Or a rosebud, or a robin on the wing.
She's a girl who feels there's something out there in life, something out there in the world beyond her little farm, but she doesn't know what it is, and she doesn't know how to get at it.
In that lyric and in that music, you can hear the longing of a young girl. Even though you might not know the character, you can feel it in the song.
Well, be spring.
You have to be careful so you don't say, all I owe, Iowa. That shows that he really, in his heart of hearts, hated New York City and wanted to live in Iowa. That's kind of silly. And in a funny way, Rodgers was able to express a lot of different things in his music. You have to say that he was extraordinarily influenced by the words that he was given.
Oh, I know, all I owe, Iowa. Iowa, all I owe, and I know why.
It's a wonderful celebration of why all these people are at the fair. And it's a catchy number. And I think the fact that Hammerstein uses the word Iowa, I mean, people don't really call Iowa. It's a sort of theatrical device that, for some reason, is terribly catchy.
I don't know how Hammerstein did it because he lived in the city, but he described this whole world of wonderful things that came out of the ground and made life wonderful for us.
The 1945 film of State Fair came out. The reviews, for the most part, were extremely positive. I mean, they knew that it wasn't Oklahoma, that it wasn't on that high artistic level. But for film, most critics did see that it was sort of expanding the vocabulary of the musical film. And it made a lot of money.
The 1945 release of State Fair was a huge success. If it hadn't been a huge success, Zanuck wouldn't have pulled it out of the drawer again in 1960 and asked them to rewrite it.
This was after Hammerstein's death, and so when State Fair came along and they needed more songs, Rogers decided he'd write the music and lyrics. The major difference, of course, is they reset it from Iowa to Texas, and they updated the story to 1962. So Wayne is now a sports car driver.
I think actually one of the sort of primary differences between the 45 version of State Fair and the 62 is that it does really feel more like an integrated Rodgers and Hammerstein musical.
By the time the remake came around, musicals could be a little bit more like Broadway shows.
State Fair was another movie that was done essentially as a vehicle for the girl who was going to play Margie, Pamela Tiffin, who was a starlet at the time, who never really went on to have a great big career.
Like Jean Crane, she wasn't a singer, so she had someone else do her voice, a woman named Anita Gordon.
As a puppet on a string.
Hey, how'd you know I came from a farm?
Didn't you mention it?
Pat Boone did not make that many pictures. He made maybe 6 pictures in his whole career. He was much happier being a recording artist.
Pat Boone was a little bit younger than Dick Haymes was. He still had the boyish quality. He had the voice. I think you get more of a feeling that he could have been on a farm and then come to this big state fair and had his eyes opened.
Well, maybe I'll never be.
Anne Margaret had, just the year before, made her film debut in A Pocket Full of Miracles, playing Betty Davis's daughter. The 1961 Academy Awards, she sang one of the nominated songs. And this really got her noticed by Hollywood and got her the role of Emily. Bobby Darin, of course, had a big movie career and a recording career. He'd won 2 Grammys, one as Best New Artist and one for his million-selling record Mac the Knife.
Tom Ewell, who was a fine character actor, was best known for playing Marilyn Monroe's would-be seducer in The 7-Year Itch. And Alice Faye was coming back to films after being away for 16 years.
All of the songs are retained from the 1945 version, other than All I Way, of course. And that was replaced by a song Rogers wrote called It's the Little Things in Texas.
It's the little things in Texas I love.
And he wrote 4 other songs as well for the 62 movie.
One of the songs that was added had actually been written for the film A Flower Drum Song. That's the song that Bobby Darin sings called This Isn't Heaven.
This isn't heaven. So what?
And then a rather peculiar song that the mother sings to her daughter called Never Say No to a Man.
Never say no to a man. Simply avoid saying yes to him.
Which nowadays doesn't get a lot of play, as you can imagine.
Darling, don't ever say.
And after the second film, the people that do musicals all over the country called the Rodgers and Hammerstein office and said, isn't there a stage version of State Fair? We'd love to do State Fair.
State Fair was the only property they'd written that didn't have a life in the place they knew and loved best, which is the live stage.
Rodgers himself was never really convinced that the stakes of the story were high enough. He felt this is a musical about a guy who makes a bet with his friend.
$5 says we go to the fair. Blue Boy wins, and nothing bad happens to Wayne or Margie or any of the rest of them.
Rodgers never really encouraged a stage adaptation. He permitted one. In the mid-1960s, they did a stage adaptation of State Fair at the St. Louis Muni Opera, and it was directed by James Hammerstein. Tommy Toon was in the show. Ozzie and Harriet played the Frakes. It was not enough of a success that at the time Rodgers felt it would become part of the theater library, the collection of shows that were licensed to perform.
So it went into the drawer and was forgotten. And it was Tom Briggs who came to me one day and said, can I take a shot at doing a stage adaptation of State Fair?
Louis Mattioli, my collaborator, and I had always talked about State Fair as a stage musical. We went to Ted Chapin, the president of R&H, and, well, he told us all the reasons that it wouldn't work, as did Bill Hammerstein, Oscar's oldest son. It had actually been tried before, but no one could quite get around how you deal with Blue Boy. You know, the hog is such a wonderful part of the movie. Louis Mattioli, my collaborator, and I decided that, the stage musical wasn't going to be about the hog. It was going to be about the family, and that you could never, in a million years, show an audience the bore of the magnificence you're led to believe Blue Boy is. The audience will do a much better job of conjuring that hog in their minds. And so that never ended up being a problem. We used all of the songs from the 1945 version, and there was one song Rogers wrote for the 62 version, More Than Just a Friend, the song that Abel sang to his hog, that we just loved, and we put that into the stage version.
Sweet hog of mine.
The 1945 movie of State Fair doesn't have enough songs to fill out a theater musical. So the task that Tom Briggs and his collaborators took on was to find songs that were written by Rodgers and Hammerstein that could be put into a stage version of it that made any kind of sense.
So we went to their lesser-known musicals, Allegro, Me and Juliet, and Pipe Dream, and pilfered a few songs from those musicals. We also found two very charming numbers that had been cut from Oklahoma before it got to Broadway. A song called When I Go Out Walking with My Baby, and a song called Boys and Girls Like You and Me, both of them just perfect for the parents in State Fair. So we ended up with about 13 songs in the score in all.
In the original 1945 film of State Fair, Wayne, the young boy from the farm, meets Emily, the singer from the big city, the first girl who he has a crush on. He hears her singing a song. It didn't take any kind of dialogue setup to get you there. He heard her singing, bingo, they're in love. And because there was time to set them up in the play, they met, they talked, and it gave Wayne an opportunity to say, that's for me, which actually makes much more sense. It's something the character is saying, whereas in the film, when Vivian Blaine sings, that's for me, it isn't anything personal coming out of her. She's a band singer singing the hit tune of the day.
In the novel, Emily doesn't have last name. Then in the 1933 version, her name is Emily Joyce. Then in the 1945 version, her name is Emily Edwards. Then in the 1962 version, her name is Emily Porter. And so we decided in the stage version that we wouldn't use any of them. We'd give her yet another last name. So we called her Emily Arden. Isn't that a pretty name? It sounds like a name you'd make up, doesn't it? Which in the stage version, you find out she did make it up. Her real name was Emma Kozlowski.
Gee, when I first saw you up there, I couldn't believe you were the same girl.
Why not? Was I that bad?
And finally, in 1995, I connected with the Theater Guild. And so they put out a tour of State Fair. And I just loved the symmetry of the Theater Guild produced the very first Rodgers and Hammerstein musical. And here they were producing what would be the last Rodgers and Hammerstein musical.
And we toured for a year, and then the show finally came into New York with David Merrick as a producer. It was the last show he did on Broadway. And we opened at the Music Box Theater. It looked and sounded like what you imagine a wonderful, old-fashioned Rodgers and Hammerstein musical must have looked and sounded like. But it was the year of Rent. It was the year of Broadway looking to something new, and the critics passed by State Fair.
It came into Broadway in a season that was crowded with other things, including The King and I.
When I started working on State Fair, my pitch to Rodgers and Hammerstein was not, let's write a Broadway musical. It was, here is this great property that every high school and community theater and summer stock theater in the country can do.
Ultimately, the audiences around the world were far more interested in it than the Broadway run led us to believe that they might be.
And we've been licensing it ever since. Because I think it really proves that the idea of making a stage adaptation of State Fair was a good idea, that everyone here can stand up and say, that's fine.
$6 the donuts at our State Fair is the best state.
Rodgers and Hammerstein wrote and produced a new musical for Broadway every other year from 1943 to 1959. So it's one of the reasons why having State Fair is kind of extraordinary. It is it's the one and only bona fide Rodgers and Hammerstein Hollywood movie.